Hey, it's that time again. I get to come back and talk about the books I have read in February. Now, February was a month when I read some longer books more slowly, so I didn't cover quite as many as I did in January, but once again, I'm going to recap them here. They're reviewed in much more detail on my blog, Compulsive Overreader, and I will be giving away a copy of one of these books to anyone who likes or shares or tweets or does whatever to let the world know about this vlog. So you remember my project to reread the classics this year? I spent quite a bit of time this month with this hefty volume, Les Miserables, which I love the musical a lot, and I read the abridged version of the novel many, many years ago, found it kind of boring. This time, I found it absolutely fascinating, even though, yes, it's very wordy and, you know, Victor Hugo's constantly going off on digressions. I really enjoyed it. There were times when I almost couldn't put it down. The other classic I've been rereading is Pride and Prejudice, which I wanted to reread after having first read it in my late 20s because I've been so caught up in watching the modern adaptation, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries on YouTube, wanted to compare it to the original, and was pleasantly surprised with how fresh and engaging and often very funny Jane Austen's original great novel is. I read one Newfoundland novel this month, Fintan Moon by Gerard Collins. This book has been very highly acclaimed, gotten great reviews, and it's well deserved. It's beautifully written. It's a coming-of-age story set in a Newfoundland town in the 1970s. There's definitely a dark side to it. There's also kind of a quirky magic realism thread running through it because Fintan Moon is not your average small-town kid. He's your average small-town kid who is bookish, shy, isolated, and has the ability to heal people with his hands. You don't get that every day. Highly recommend you check this one out. The Aviators Wife by Melanie Benjamin. You may remember that one of hers was a favorite of mine last year. This is another of her stories where she does a great job of taking a woman who we know from history mainly because of her connection with a famous man and making her into a very believable person. In this case, it's Anne Morrow Lindbergh, wife of the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, and I found this really engrossing. You may have heard me talking about this one on my Writing Wednesday vlog earlier this month. Between by Carrie Schaefer, a new release by a very good friend of mine. Always exciting to see a friend's book out, especially when it's a nice mass market paperback produced by a fairly big publisher, which means lots of people are going to get to read it, and that's great. Between is a fantasy novel, starts off kind of urban fantasy, where Vivian Mailer is an ER doctor living what appears to be a relatively normal life until very abnormal things start happening, and she discovers herself moving in the worlds between the dream world, the wake world, and the area known as between. And there's also a mysterious stranger who appears both in the dream world and in her real world. If you like fantasy, definitely check this one out. In February, I finished reading a book that I had started way back when I first got it at Christmas as a Christmas gift. Not because it wasn't interesting, but because it's a book that you can read slowly in small bites, a bit at a time. It's Yann Martel's 101 Letters to a Prime Minister. A lot of Canadians are familiar with Yann Martel's project of sending a book every 2 weeks to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, along with a letter explaining why he's recommending this particular book. Not only a lot of Yann Martel's opinions about world literature come into this, but of course also a lot of his politics, because it becomes pretty clear early on that he doesn't approve of a lot of Stephen Harper's policies or politics, but he recommends the books he thinks the Prime Minister ought to read, writes to him on a bi-weekly basis over several years, and never once gets an answer. These short essays about books make fascinating reading, and they'll probably introduce you to a few new titles you might want to check out. They certainly did for me. Along with my various other reading projects, like rereading the classics and reading poetry, there's a thing I do almost every year during the season of Lent, where I kind of give up fiction for Lent. This month I hung on to the classics, but other than that I didn't read any new fiction. And instead I try to pick up a lot of nonfiction, some of it dealing with faith and spirituality, some of it heavier and kind of theological or historical, and some memoirs too. So I kind of focus on nonfiction reading. And the first book on my Lenten reading list, which I'm sure you won't be able to see really well, couldn't find a copy of it at the bookstore, but I read it on my e-reader. It's by Jay Baker, and it's called Faith, Doubt, and Other Lines I've Crossed, Walking with the Unknown God. It's a really interesting reflection on the role of doubt and uncertainty in the life of faith. Jay Baker draws a lot on his own experience, and he's also unique in that he is someone who certainly grew up very much with and has ministered in the evangelical Christian milieu, but is a very strong advocate for gays and lesbians and for inclusiveness within the church. So he's a voice that I think really needs to be heard, and I found this a very interesting book, Faith, Doubt, and Other Lines I've Crossed. Another of the great nonfiction reads I picked up this month. Probably not going to be able to see this really well. Again, I could only get it on the e-reader, so it's very difficult to see the cover, but it's called Most of Me by Canadian writer Robin Levy. When Anne Lamott was first writing, she said that she started writing during her father's experience with terminal cancer. While her family was going through that, she went to the librarian and asked the librarian, "Where are all the funny books on cancer?" And the librarian just gave her a strange look. But if she was looking for that today, I would highly recommend Robin Levy's, because it is one of the funny books on cancer, and not just cancer. Within a very short period of time, Robin Levy was diagnosed first with Parkinson's disease and then with breast cancer. She was a middle-aged woman, active in her career, married, raising a daughter, and obviously this just blew her out of the water like it would. First a degenerative disease and then cancer. But this is the very funny and very warm and personal story of how she copes with it. It is never sentimental, it's always raw and honest, but really great writing, really enjoyable. I haven't given up on the reading poetry project. This month's poetry book was Soak by Carrie Cull, a Newfoundland poet. Emma calls this the book with the legs, which I guess you can sort of see why. Great cover design and really interesting poetry. Again, I can't really critique poetry. I can compare it to the Mary Oliver poems I read last month by saying that Mary Oliver's poems seem to me to be about a person often standing alone in the natural space, contemplating a tree or a landscape. Carrie Cull's poems feel to me like they're full of people and places and built environments, even if sometimes the other people other than the speaker are just out of the frame, maybe have just left the room. And I'm going to read a favorite of mine from this collection called Apartment. You always slept on our unforgiving couch. It was faded to a feverish sand on the arms and where bottoms sat the most. The pillow and blanket fought for your comfort against springs prodding your back. You slept there for hours that year in sequences of 2 or 3. Little pieces of you fell between the folds, leftover alcohol on your breath, garlic, cigarette smoke. It all clung to the walls, sinking into the wood of us that was covered again by new flavors of food and stains of our breath and build. Our skin is all over that apartment. Ledge corners, tops of door frames, book spines, remaining silently the same. Well, as I continue into March, I will be picking up another classic of literature. I will be looking at the work of another poet, and I'll be continuing with my Lenten reading list of nonfiction, and I've got some great titles ahead on that. And if you like or favorite or share this video, then I will enter your name for a drawing, and like last month's winner Dara, you too could win any book from this month's list. So please share this around, and hope you enjoy your reading in the month ahead. I know I will.